Our first speaker is going to be Alex Callinicos. Alex is a leading member of the SWP, writes a weekly column for Socialist Worker, and has a new book coming out, The New Age of Catastrophe, very soon. Our second speaker, who we're delighted accepted the invitation this afternoon, is Gilbert Achcar. Gilbert is Lebanese, is a socialist academic from SOAS, and has another new book coming out called The New Cold War. So not a lot of laughs there. Very serious, obviously, discussion, because there's a whole discussion going on about debating the war in the Ukraine. Each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes. There are going to be team members circulating. We're going to run speakers' slips to the session so we can try and ensure we get a wide range of contributions. And then each of the speakers will be coming back for 5 or 6 minutes at the end. So I hope you enjoy the discussion. Do think about filling in a speaker's slip. No question or point is too trivial or isn't interesting. So let's have a good debate this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Alex to start us off.
Thanks very much, though I always say you should save your applause for the end in case you like what I say. But it's very nice to be here, and it's very nice to be seeing you all, you know, in 3 dimensions after the strange existence that we've had for the past couple of years. Now, but it's not, I mean, Jan made a joke about the titles of our 2 books, but it's not really very easy to be cheerful about things at the minute. Not very far to our east, a horror is unfolding. In Ukraine, we have an old-fashioned conventional war involving, in particular, large-scale artillery bombardments going on. Casualties on each side are estimated to be 200 killed every day. We know from the stories that the media emphasize that a lot of civilians are being killed in the kind of indiscriminate bombardments being mounted by the Russian invading forces. And we also know that millions of people have been displaced from their homes, in many cases to flee the entire country, to move actually not just west into the EU, but also east to Russia and other parts of the former Russian Empire. This is absolutely horrible, and of course we have to be against this war. We in the Socialist Workers' Party have opposed the Russian invasion, and we demand that Russia immediately and unconditionally withdraw its troops. But when we're confronting this horror, we have to see this as a situation that it isn't simply a bipolar, if you like, confrontation between Ukraine and Russian imperialism. That is the starting point of the hot war that is now raging, but it's not the full story. This is a game with at least 3 players. The third player is Western imperialism, by which I mean the United States, its allies in NATO, but also, for example, Australia, Canada, and to some extent, Japan. They are united in both providing military support to the Ukrainian government, but also in mounting economic sanctions against Russia. And so therefore we confront a more complex situation than a straightforward bipolar conflict. Now, and the scale of the military support is now immense. The United States is spending, I think, something like, including what it's spent since the start of the war, something like $44 billion. They're supplying increasingly complex and long-range weapons, howitzers, anti-tank missiles, the HIMARS multiple rocket systems that can fire quite a long range. NATO held a major summit last week, and at that they decided to increase, if you like, the military wing of NATO, the combat wing of NATO, the rapid deployment force, from 40,000 to over 300,000. Biden announced increases in US troop numbers that raised the size of the US forces in Europe from 80,000 before Russia invaded Ukraine to 120,000. He's going to cite 2 additional squadrons of stealth bombers in Britain. The US and Britain are moving additional troops to the borders between the EU and Russia. This is a massive military mobilization that the Western imperialist powers is mounting. And this is a mobilization directed at Russia. Don't take my word for it. NATO agreed on a new strategic concept which explicitly identifies Russia as the most immediate threat to Western interests and values. It's interesting they use that phrase, interests and values. That's about economics and ideology combined. So this is a war with 2 dimensions. It's a war of national defense on the part of Ukrainians against the Russian invasion. But it's also an inter-imperialist conflict in which the United States is waging a proxy war using Ukraine against Russia. And in the background, that's why I said there are at least 3 players in this conflict, but not very far in the background is the developing antagonism between the US and China, the great global conflict that is going to dominate the world probably for decades to come. A conflict which shapes what's happening in the war in Ukraine. If people want to ask questions about that, I can elaborate it in discussion. But for some people on the left, their focus is on the first dimension of the conflict, the war between Ukraine and Russia. So I want to use the example of now it's very irritating, my stopwatch disappeared, but it's come back again, happily. I want to use the example of a statement that was issued a few weeks ago involving a lot of Marxist intellectuals around the world, often from a Trotskyist background. Gilbert is one of the signatories, but there are lots of other people, friends of mine like Bob Brenner in the United States, a number of leading Brazilian revolutionary socialists. And it focuses entirely on the conflict between Ukraine and Russian imperialism. And they invoke the Vietnam War, the struggle of the Vietnamese people against US imperialism to justify it. They say it cannot be said that this is a war between imperialisms because Ukraine is not an imperialist country, but is penetrated by Russia and Western capital. This is sophism, because it writes out of the picture what the US and the rest of NATO are doing to support Ukraine. I think it's a mistake, as some people say, to say that Ukraine is still a colony or a neo-colony of Russia. Since 2014, since the Ukrainian political system tilted decisively westwards, the links between Ukraine and Western imperialism have become stronger and stronger, including at the military level. I read a very interesting article by the former commanding general of the US Army Europe, in which he described how US Army teams have been intensively training the Ukrainian army since 2015. In the year before the Russian invasion, the US supplied $1 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine. But the statement, rather than confronting these realities, implies that it is racist to say it's a proxy war, because this would make Ukrainians a mere toy in the hands of NATO. But I think this is a completely misleading way of putting it. A proxy war isn't a war where the country doing the actual fighting are just kind of robots doing the orders of the country that is using them as proxies. No, there's a convergence of interests that takes place. So, for example, I think the Korean War, 1950 to 53, was a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, with Stalin and his successors using both the North Korean regime under Kim Il-sung and China under Mao Zedong as the Soviet Union's proxies in that war. Now, if you read the history, Kim Il-sung was very, very keen to attack South Korea. He really wanted to have a go. So he wanted the war, but he was carefully managed by Stalin, because Stalin wanted both to push the West backwards in Asia, but he also wanted to tie the Chinese regime, fresh from its revolutionary victory in 1949, tied it to the Soviet Union. So, you know, the states that are used at proxies have their own national autonomy and interests, but they are used for much more powerful by much more powerful states for their ends. This is what's happening now. What is the end that the US is pursuing? Ask Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary. Our aim is to weaken Russia. That, he was very, very explicit, so explicit that Biden told him off for letting the cat out of the bag. The US explicitly sees itself in a conflict with what it calls the autocratic powers, by which it means the autocracies, in particular China and Russia. It didn't necessarily choose this war. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it is using the war to weaken Russia and to send a signal to China that if you try and take Taiwan by force, we will stop you. Now, and the comparison with the Vietnam War is particularly inappropriate, I think. The Vietnamese Communist Party led a national liberation struggle against first French and then American imperialism for 45 years. A comrade of Gilbert's, Pierre Rousset, wrote a very good book about this. After they defeated the French in the early 1950s, the Vietnamese were effectively betrayed by Russia and China, which at talks in Geneva in 1955 forced the Vietnamese Communist Party to accept the partition of Vietnam between North and South. The war with the US started when the Viet Cong, communists in South Vietnam, organized their own uprising. It's true that the Vietnamese Communist Party, then based in the north, received lots of military aid from Russia and indeed China, but this was the period of the split between Moscow and Beijing, and the Vietnamese leadership were able to retain their autonomy by playing the two sides off against them, and the offensives they mounted, sorry, my throat is going, for reasons best known to itself. Could I have some plain water? The offensives like the Tet Offensive were very much the autonomous choice of the Vietnamese leadership. There's no comparison with Ukraine today. Thanks very much. And I think the problem is with Gilbert and the people who, in many cases I know and admire, who signed that statement, is that they don't do the thing that Lenin insisted on during the First World War, but is to grasp the complexity of the situation, and all its contradictions as a whole, and to see their interconnection. So Gilbert wrote a very good article criticizing NATO and its eastward expansion the other day. But he didn't relate that analysis to what's happening in Ukraine. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. And the problem with the position that Gilbert and his co-signatories take is that it's not simply based on a false analysis, an integrated analysis that sets what's happening in Ukraine and all its horrors in the context of the inter-imperialist struggle that is developing, not just at a European but a global scale, but that it leaves no place for the left in this situation. If you say, we support Ukraine fighting the Russians, we want the Russians kicked out, we support arms shipments to Ukraine. I mean, Gilbert, at the start of the war, drew a distinction between defensive and offensive weapons, but I don't think that's sustainable, really. And the statement doesn't go into those sorts of details. If you take that position, you are entirely operating within the mainstream of politics in the major Western capitalist states, not the rest of the world, because everyone knows by now that when you move to the global south, the enthusiasm for confronting Russia evaporates very, very quickly, but you're part of the Western mainstream if you simply and forget about NATO. Yeah, and in a way, I just want to refer briefly to the tragic case of Paul Mason, and I don't want to in any sense associate Gilbert with him. But if you look at Mason, leaving aside the stuff that you find on the internet about the people he's been working with, but in a way that's secondary, what you see is he's been striving to take a more and more radical position in support of the Ukrainian government. And that means demanding yet more arms. It demands increasing military spending. He's trying to look for a more radical position in support of Ukraine than the mainstream. But that's completely pathetic. If what you're trying to achieve is an even bigger Ministry of Defense, more Polaris submarines, or whatever they're called now, Poseidon submarines, and the rest of the ghastly armory of modern nuclear imperialism. So I think that the kind of position that Gilbert and his comrades take in that statement, which, to emphasize, is not the same as Mason's, but it represents a political vacuum. It's saying, this is a terrible war, we support Ukraine, but that's it. We don't have a distinctive leftist position to take on this war. You can just see us as belonging to the mainstream. That is reminiscent of the position, it's not the same, but it's reminiscent of the position that Karl Kautsky took during the First World War. During the First World War, you have the major social democratic parties collapsing into support for their different national governments. Kautsky's response is to say, this is very unfortunate, I'm very sorry about that, but we shouldn't say that the Socialist International, the Second International, is finished. We'll simply suspend it during the course of hostilities and we'll get back together afterwards. That's what a lot of the left internationally is doing. They're essentially suspending operations on this war, which has a dynamic of escalation that doesn't simply threaten the people in the immediate area, but has the potential for nuclear confrontation. And there are all these idiots in defense, think tanks and so on in the West who are talking up the idea of defeating Russia in a situation where Russia can't be beaten. Russia is a nuclear power. You can't defeat it militarily in this kind of situation. In a conventional war, when Russia has a doctrine of using tactical nuclear weapons. So we have, in these circumstances, to go back to the position of Lenin and Luxemburg at the start of the First World War. which was incidentally to say that the Second International wasn't indeed dead, but to start from the question of imperialism and to take a position that targeted the system that had produced the war and to focus particularly on their own ruling classes. Carl Liebknecht's slogan, the main enemy is at home. Whereas if you take the kind of position that the comrades do, the main enemy isn't at home. He's in the Kremlin. It's Putin. Is that the source of all the world's problems? Is that how this war has happened? Not at all. It's not serious to take that kind of political stance. So I really hope that Gilbert and the comrades like him who, for reasons in particular of detestation of Russian imperialism, which is perfectly justified, I hope that they will rethink that position and rejoin the genuinely anti-imperialist camp.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And now I'll hand over to Gilbert.
Thank you very much. I thank the organizers for their invitation and this new opportunity to discuss with my old friend Alex. We've been I think it's been over 30 years we've been discussing on various issues together. So it's a pleasure for me to continue this discussion because it's a discussion between revolutionary Marxists. That is what we are, whatever implications there may be for what has been said. So let me start by the fact of emphasizing that the world, since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, entered into a situation called bipolarity, in which you had an opposition between two empires, the one dominated by Washington, of course, and the other dominated by Moscow. And by the way, I'm speaking to an audience that belongs to a movement whose slogan was neither Washington nor Moscow, right? Except that during the Cold War, which was a zero-sum game between the two empires, every kind of struggle in the world, every kind of war in particular, was turned immediately. If it involved in any way one of the two empires, the other empire would use it to fight, to help those fighting the rival empire. That applied to all the wars in the time of the Cold War. And I think there is a clear, in my view, inconsistency in the position, historical position taken by, or defended now by Alex. He was too young at the time of taking it. This is the Korea War. The Korea War was, above all, a proxy war between US imperialism and the Chinese Revolution. And to say that one should have been neutral in a war where US troops, thousands of miles away from their country, are intervening against local forces, whatever you think of the Korean communists, whatever you think of the Chinese communists behind them, and whatever you think of the Soviet Union support there, to say that one should have been neutral is completely inconsistent. And as for the Vietnam War, I'm sorry, Alex, but the degree of support of the Soviet Union to Vietnam was far above the degree of support of the Soviet Union to North Korea. And let me tell you one thing. The Soviet Union, which your international current regarded as a state capitalist country, as well as China, you regarded China as a state capitalist country. So you have two state capitalist countries, so you have two capitalist empires in the world, right? Well, look at what the Soviet Union gave and China gave to Vietnam. much more than whatever is being given now to Ukraine. Let me give you just a few figures. 500 aircraft, including 180 fighters, including MiG-29, which was the most advanced the Russians had at that time. 2,500 tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, anti-aircraft missiles with also Soviet so-called trainers handling them on the spot. So you had a huge support for the Vietnamese by the Soviet Union. So by the same logic, especially if one regards the Soviet Union, as was your case, as an imperialist country, a state capitalist country, then what should have said, no, like what your historical current said about Korea, we are against this war. We don't take sides in this war. That's utterly inconsistent in my view. So now that was the Cold War. I have since 1999 published a book whose title was The New Cold War, and it is the content of that book that I'm republishing with which much more added to that, updating the analysis. But the key point is that indeed, since the 90s, we entered into a new Cold War, and the main culprit, and I've written that several times, and Alex probably knows that, the main culprit for this situation is the United States, is NATO, definitely. The United States bears the main responsibility in creating the conditions during the 90s and afterward that led to what I characterize as a new Cold War, with the same kind of zero-sum game between Russia tending to ally with China, versus NATO, the United States, Japan, all the strategic alliances dominated by Washington. So it is definitely Washington's responsibility to have created the kind of world in which we are. And that applies to this issue as it applies to many other issues, because the United States was in such a dominant position at the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it held the main keys to the world situation. They themselves used to say in their document, shaping the world. That was what they were doing, and they shaped the terrible world in which we are indeed. So, when I say that, not here, but in the general public, I'll get people telling me, you are excusing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because the dominant discussion is not the one we have here. The dominant discussion, the mainstream discussion, is completely different. So when you say that, that's what you are told. You are justifying or excusing or finding excuses to the Russian invasion. Well, I don't buy into this kind of explanation. To say that Britain, France, and America were responsible in creating, in 1919, the conditions that led to the rise of Hitler, to say that does not in any way justify what Hitler did, right? So this is a way of trying to prevent the discussion, which is very much in the mainstream. Now, the Russian invasion is very clearly a great Russian chauvinist from the point of view of the ideology. It is imperialist, modern. We can have a lot of discussion about the nature of the Soviet Union. I don't think there is any room for discussion between Marxists about the nature of present-day Russia as an imperialist country. And Ukraine has been traditionally regarded as a colony by the Russian, and therefore you have the whole colonial imperialist dimension of this invasion of Ukraine. For the Ukrainians, from the Ukrainian side, this is a war of national defense. like the war of the Vietnamese against the Americans or the war of the Koreans also against the Americans. This is a war of national defense, and therefore it is a just war. The Ukrainian resistance is legitimate. It is defending its country, its people, the sovereignty of its nation, and this is something that we, as left-wing, as Marxists, as radicals, we support, we definitely support. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are getting weapons from NATO. I mean, if we consider, Alex said, we are for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the Russian troops. That means that this invasion is completely I mean, is an imperialist invasion which should be repelled. Then, how do we want the Ukrainians to fight against Russian imperialism? They don't have weapons of their own, and I don't think that the SWP is in a position to send them weapons that would change anything in this situation. It's the same for the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese would not have been able to fight US imperialism without support from Russia, from the Soviet Union, the USSR, and from China. That would not have been possible. So, again, this is the kind of situation that you have every time you have a war between an imperialist power and a much weaker and smaller country. The country either has to surrender, to be occupied, to lose its sovereignty and the rest, or if it is to fight back the invasion, it needs weapons. And these weapons, they come from here. I mean, I'm sure Alex is familiar with Leon Trotsky's writings on that and saying that even if Nazi Germany was sending weapons to the Algerians to fight French colonialism in their country, that should have been supported, not in the sense that you will go in demonstrations saying, long live Nazi Germany, and I'm not saying, and no one is saying, we have to demonstrate to say, long live Boris Johnson's support to Ukraine. Actually, I wrote a piece about the braggadocio of Boris Johnson, how it is completely unhelpful, actually, to the Ukrainian, the way that he is trying to outbid everybody, the wag the dog situation that we were familiar with in this context. So, this is the condition that we have, and this is not an academic debate, of course. This is, of course, a debate between socialists and activists. And therefore, we always draw a distinction between oppressive wars and just wars. When a war is an imperialist war, our position is defeatism. That is, including sabotage, including everything, refusing to fight, supporting deserters, whatever it takes on the imperialist side to weaken the imperialist side, to accelerate or to wish or to work for its defeat. And this is the position that the Russian left is taking. Sorry, Alex, I mean, you say the left is not here. I'm sorry, the left in Eastern European countries is much more on the position I'm defending than on the position that you defend. Whether the Russian left, the Russian radical left, or the Ukrainian radical left. And what are the Ukrainian radical left doing? The comrades of the social movement of Ukraine, what are they doing? They are taking part in the territorial militias, that is like the National Guard in France or whatever. This is where civilians are engaged in the fighting and contribute to the war effort. That's what they are doing, and rightly so. Does this prevent them from saying Zelensky is a neoliberal and fighting against Zelensky? Of course not. But we are also familiar with wars of national defense against colonial powers where you fight alongside people who are completely unpalatable from your class perspective, but with whom you find yourself in a single fight against a national oppressor. That is the situation that you have. And to say that we are against them receiving weapons from NATO means, again, that we are for their surrender. And I'm sorry, I'm not for the surrender for the Ukrainians. I defend the right to get weapons from whichever source they can get. If you had a revolutionary state, you know, I don't know, Bolshevik Russia or whatever, that would be great, but you don't have it. So either you get into very abstract position, like the one explained by Alex, or you are concrete. And I know what I'm speaking of. I come from a region where the Palestinian resistance for very long was funded and armed by the Saudi kingdom, the most reactionary, most anti-woman state on earth. So what? They were taking weapons where they could get them in their fight against the Zionist state. And we know, we have seen those kind of discussions, and we should beware of what I call contemptuous denial of agency to any population. In this case, the Ukrainians. Yesterday, the Syrians, and this Alex also knows about that. How many people on the left we heard explaining to you that, well, United States and the Gulf countries are supporting the Syrian uprising, and therefore we should support Assad. I mean, that's not our kind of approach. We should beware of neo-campism, the motto of which is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is the kind of logic that a major part of the left, including in this country, a major part of Stop the War coalition, this is the kind of logic that you have, where the main enemy is Washington, and everything against Washington becomes a lesser evil at best. For some, it becomes something good. This is what is at stake here in this discussion. Our position is against all imperialist countries, all of them. There is no lesser evil to choose between them. We are against all imperialist countries. We are for the right of peoples to self-determination. That's the meaning of anti-imperialism, the real meaning. And the defense of the right of the Ukrainian to self-determination, I think, is very clear in this regard. That includes the right to get weapons from whichever source is available, as I said. Now, NATO, of course, has been tremendously reinforced, and I've written that also a lot of times in recent days, by what Vladimir Putin did. I mean, yesterday there was on BBC or something like that, a former NATO commander saying that he raises his hat to Vladimir Putin for having achieved that what all the US presidents weren't able to achieve, which is reboot NATO completely, re-strengthen NATO, and even enlarge NATO. Again, a new round of enlargement, much more important actually than any previous one of the last 20 years, because it involves a country that has 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. That's extremely serious situation, extremely dangerous. So we have to fight against NATO for the dissolution of NATO and all military alliances. And what is going on with NATO, the Madrid summit, the most serious thing about it is not, I would say, Russia, because that was already there. Russia was designated by NATO as the enemy since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea by Russia. What is more serious and dangerous is the extension of NATO's area of interest to China, to the Asia-Pacific. And this goes in the same direction of Boris Johnson and his AUKUS pact and all that. And this is extremely dangerous imperialist policies, creating conditions, global conditions, that really put the world at the brink, really, of a major disaster, compared to which this ongoing Ukraine war would be quite a little thing. So this is the position that we should have against NATO, for the dissolution of NATO, and of course against its expansion, and for disarmament. This is an old principle of the workers' movement. Engels wrote a famous, Friedrich Engels, famous pamphlet on that. And we have had, this campaign should be resumed, international global campaign for disarmament and for peace. This is, I think, the position that corresponds to Marxist internationalism as I understand it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Gilbert. Well, now we're opening it up to contributions.
Okay, I'm sorry about my difficult surname. So it's impossible for English people to pronounce it. Thank you, Alex and Gilbert, for the debate. I want to go directly into what you said, Gilbert, in the end. I try to bring together the demand for disarmament and the support for the arms shipments of the NATO state, because I think from the perspective of the NATO states, the EU and the governments, these questions of arms shipments and armament are mixed together or intertwined directly. I want to give you an example. There's a strong support in the German ruling class for the NATO approach. 2 days after the beginning of the war, our Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced 100 billion euros to be spent in armament in German army. They decided on buying killer drones, which was not accepted in the German population since now, and they decided to overcome another taboo. This is to send heavy arms directly into war regions. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, said that in connection to the arms shipments is that Russia should not get on its feet again. And so I think it's very clear that from the perspective of the ruling classes in the West, the support for the military support is directly mixed with their own geostrategical, military and economic interest. And so I think it is very important that we build an opposition towards this. Die Linke decided last weekend that we oppose arms shipments to Ukraine. We had an argument on the question of sanctions and we have a contradictory position. So people demand sanctions on the military complex and the oligarchs. Maybe you can comment on this, but at the same time, we say sanctions shouldn't affect the normal population and shouldn't affect the normal population all over the world. And so I think there's an inconsistent position that was decided by the party, by my party. But I think it's important that we focus on building the anti-war movement and at the same time develop also other demands that are so important. For example, the cancellations of debt of Ukraine, to support the trade unions in Ukraine that fight against the crushing down of the labor laws by the Zelensky government. I think this is what leftists should argue about everywhere. And Karl Liebknecht said the main enemy is at home. This is right. And he said that down with the warmongers on both sides of the frontiers of the fence. And so I think we have to build the anti-war movement in this sense.
Well, I apologize because I misunderstood the assignment. I assumed I would write down my question and it would be read out, so I didn't think I would be coming up here. It's a question for both speakers, but there's a poster that is around saying, someone might have to read it out to me, it's on the bottom of the stage, and it says, stop the war, no to war, Russian troops out of Ukraine, no to Western and Russian imperialism, and no to NATO. So my question would be, what practical method do we have, can we consider, to pushing Russia out of Ukraine if it isn't a military intervention that we participate in?
Thank you. Thank you. Judith is going to be followed by Anastasia Nazarug. I hope I've pronounced that right.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit about the building the anti-war movement here in Britain in these recent months. I'm a national officer for the Stop the War Coalition here in Britain, and I think it's been absolutely vital that the coalition has taken a position of opposing the Russian invasion and calling for Russian troops out, and to say that we're against NATO expansionism and to look at the role of the West. And I think, obviously, it's been very different to building the anti-war movement when it's been our government that's doing the invading and the occupying, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan and others. It's more complicated, but actually it's still absolutely vital that we identify what's actually going on, that this is an inter-imperialist conflict, that there is a situation where the West's role in this cannot be ignored, and the Ukrainians have got the misfortune to be living in the front line of this inter-imperialist conflict. And I think if we look at it, to be honest, I think the role of the West is becoming clearer to people, isn't it? I think that position is becoming vindicated. When we look at it, Biden and Johnson and the general NATO leadership, they're not arming Zelensky and the Ukrainians out of any compassion for what the Ukrainians are going through. It's part of their own strategic interests. They want to weaken Russia, and they're more openly saying repeatedly they want to beat Russia in order then to be able to face the enemy they want to go to in terms of China. This is more and more open about what their interests are. And I think the other important reason why I think it's very important for us in Britain and us in the West to criticize NATO and to point to their role is because that means we can then go to those brave anti-war activists in Russia itself and say, we're on your side because we understand the role of our governments and our military in what's going on there. Now, obviously, I know that what they faced in Russia has been absolutely appalling in terms of the repression, but there has been people speaking out. And unless you criticize your own governments and your own military leaders and politicians, then you cannot then side with anti-war activists in Russia itself if you treat it as a block, as a monolithic block of an enemy, whereas as if the whole of the Russian society supports Putin. And in fact, is that the end or 1 minute? 1 minute. Oh, brilliant. Okay, 1 minute on our government. I mean, Boris Johnson is so cynical that he has used the suffering of the Ukrainians as a distraction, hasn't he? When he flies over there and goes on about how brave he is in order to distract from Partygate, the cost of living crisis and all the rest. How cynical can you get to use the suffering and then pretending the open arms for Ukrainian refugees, which obviously many people did welcome, but the fact is they haven't put money behind it. They haven't done anything, as they haven't done for refugees from the wars that they caused over the years. And I don't trust Boris Johnson and his government with our lives and our interests. Why on earth would I trust him and his pals in the West and Biden and the rest of it with the interests of the Ukrainian people? And I think it's finally criminal that a Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has made it a crime within the Labour Party to criticise NATO. We just heard from Jeremy Corbyn, who's still being kept out of the whip because of standing up. And NATO now, you're not allowed to mention it in the Labour Party. So I commend those Labour activists who have been active in the anti-war movement and stood against that and said that we do oppose Russian troops in Ukraine and want them to pull out, but we also want NATO to get out of the region too.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Is Anastasia going to be followed by Richard Boyd Barrett?
I think starting from 2014...
Could you go nearer the mic?
Yeah, okay. I think starting from 2014, we all witnessed what has been happening in the world, and we all kind of learned to read between the lines, to read the newspapers between the lines, to listen BBC and thinking that maybe something is hidden from what they are saying. And I will be saying that this is a special operation because I've got every reason to say so. And my question is that if we all understand that it's another proxy war between NATO and Russia, how come Putin fell into this trap? He was the one who started this special operation. How come he kind of decided to start the whole thing knowing that he'll be fighting NATO and there is no winning in this special operation?
Thank you. Richard is going to be followed by Andy Zabrowski from Poland.
Look, we all agree, or I hope we do agree, that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a bloody, imperialist, inexcusable, murderous invasion. But in Ireland, we are a neutral country. And that neutrality comes from the Irish anti-imperialist tradition, the revolution against British imperialism, and very specifically, James Connolly's opposition to the First World War and his determination when that war broke out and was justified on the basis of the German imperialist invasion of Belgium, where the ruling class in Ireland, as they did on the western side, said we should all go out and fight to defend oppressed Belgium. Connolly, along with others, said, no, this is the moment we must strike against our own ruling class and against the British Empire, because he understood that the First World War would be a slaughter, and it was. 14 million people killed. Since the invasion of Russia, the Irish ruling class have been jumping, since the invasion of Ukraine, have been jumping with joy, saying now is the time to reevaluate Irish neutrality and to increase arms expenditure and attend, as they did last week, the meeting in Madrid with NATO. This is despite the fact the vast majority of people in Ireland are opposed to getting rid of our neutrality and stand with the anti-imperialist tradition. So that is the net result. If we start to back NATO's agenda of throwing arms into this, conventional military warfare, inter-imperialist conflict, it is a weapon they are using to crush the genuine anti-imperialist tradition. And they are doing it very systematically and very consciously in Ireland. And we have to resist that. Because the truth is, of course we stand with the Ukrainian people against this imperialist invasion. But does anybody seriously think a conventional war in Ukraine is going to be anything other than a disaster for the Ukrainian people?
1 minute.
When Ireland was occupied, the revolutionaries like Connolly did not say, let's look for military support from other imperialist powers. Rather, they understood they had to strike out against all imperialism. All imperialism. And we cannot be a party to the rotten double standards of the big imperial powers, the same people who bombed Iraq into the Stone Age, killed 1 million people, and our government tried to facilitate that. And they say, we want to defend the oppressed Ukrainians who are repressed, and we absolutely stand with Ukrainian people, but say nothing about Saudi's brutal war backed by the United States, by France and Britain, bombing the hell out of Yemen. Say absolutely nothing about Israel's apartheid regime and its persecution of the Palestinian people, who are using the Ukrainian situation in order to rehabilitate imperialism and attack the genuine anti-imperialist tradition. No, if you're against war and imperialism, you have to stand up against all war and all imperialism, not use this as an opportunity or fall into the trap of rehabilitating and legitimizing the agenda of NATO and the Western imperialists. That would be a disastrous mistake.
Okay, thank you. I don't think Rob Ferguson is the next speaker, and then they'll be followed by Lucia Pradella.
Okay, I'm a socialist living in Poland, and I think what I want to start with is actually Vietnam, because you could foresee a victory for the Vietnamese by kicking the US out of Vietnam. when we're talking about Russia in Ukraine, what does the victory look like in terms of NATO versus Russia? Does that mean that there's going to be a march on Moscow? Does that mean that they're going to take over, they're going to occupy parts of Russia? How is that victory supposed to look? It's a completely different situation, in my opinion, between Vietnam and the Ukrainian. When it comes to the left, the most left-wing part of Polish social democracy, the leader of that grouping, it's called Razem Together, he said that we are against all imperialisms after the 24th of February. And then the leader of that social democratic organization looked at him quizzically saying, how dare you say something like that? The only imperialism is really Russian imperialism. And since then, they've shut up about it. They voted for increased arms expenditure. So Poland is now not spending 2% on weapons, but 3% of GDP on the weapons.
1 minute, Andy.
If NATO is supposed to be dissolved, why then is NATO part of the solution to this problem, to this war? We should be arguing that NATO should be kept up because perhaps Russia is going to attack more of its near abroad in the near future. Why don't we argue then for maintaining NATO so that we can carry on sending arms to the countries bordering Russia? See, the problem of agency, you talk about the problem of agency, and I think really this is the question that worries most people, that they think that people don't care about the Ukrainians. We're just talking about imperialism, the Western imperialism and Russia, and we're not talking about the interests of the Ukrainians. But really, the Zelensky government is not the interest of the Ukrainians. The Zelensky government has hitched itself to NATO. The Ukrainian government has done that even before the Russian attack. So the question of agency is really vital for socialists. We do not include NATO, the biggest military alliance in the world, in the question of Ukrainian agency. Our agency is something different. Now we've got massive inflation in all the countries around the world, and we've got, like in our newspaper, on the front page, we've got time for a summer of strikes. Here we've got bus workers with flares. They've taken over a bus, and it says, Workers' Rebellion. They've taken over destination Workers' Rebellion. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for the unity of peace movements around the world. We're looking for workers' unity around the world and not seeing NATO as part of the agency of the Ukrainian people.
Okay. All right. Rob Ferguson is going to be followed, as I said, by Lucia, and that will be last contributions.
At the heart of this debate and the argument is how we frame the defining feature driving this war. And that's where the question of the inter-imperialist character of the war is so important. And by the way, I'm sorry, I think, Gilbert, you're wrong about Korea and China. It's not about how close the confrontation is. No imperialist power is defensive. Not China in Korea, not Russia in its near abroad. That is not the attitude we take. Every imperialist power attempts to oppress other nations, other peoples, and its own working class. And I think Vietnam is also different for the reasons that Alex spelled out, but also because during the Cold War, almost without exception, the great powers observed their respective spheres of influence up to the point where it would mean outright confrontation. That is not the case here in Ukraine. And it is true that there are those on the Russian and Ukrainian left that Gilbert refers to who do support weapons to Ukraine from NATO. However, it's by no means all, and it's not reflective of the population, and I think in part it reflects the demoralization and despair, understandable, particularly in Ukraine, facing the destruction and savagery of Russian imperialism, but also in Russia, where the left and the anti-war movement now feels so disempowered and isolated. They think that the idea that somehow defeat in war will get rid of Putin
1 minute, Rob.
for you starts to hold out. I just therefore finished with this. Look, in Russia, the opinion polls show that 60% of the population think that the US and NATO are the main drivers of the war. 16% think it's Ukraine. In 2001, 60% said they did not think that NATO countries were a threat to Russia. Now 60% do. And I want to finish with this about how you define the war. You see, I think the problem is that what it rules out, if you dismiss the question of inter-imperialist character of the war, you lose the focus on the main enemy at home in every country. And that means you cannot build an international war movement. Anti-war movement. You can't build an anti-war movement here. You end up supporting your own imperialists in fueling the war.
Right, thank you. And Lucia.
Thank you. I have a question for Gilbert. I think what we've seen today is the same approach that you took in 2011 when there were the uprisings in Libya, and you kept saying that we needed to have a concrete approach, and for this reason you supported a no-fly zone against the Gaddafi regime. And I wanted to ask you what kind of lessons about the role of NATO you've drawn from the Libyan experience, since after 10 years of that intervention, we've seen a country that had the highest development indexes in Africa being reduced to a destroyed country where basically slavery has become the dominant mode of production. And I think we need to draw lessons from this experience, and we need to look at the role of NATO and Western imperialism, not only in the process that led to this war, as Alex has described earlier on, and that you have completely ignored today, but also in the role that Western imperialism is playing right now in changing and destroying Ukrainian society. Let's look at the role of the US and US aid in, for example, supporting the Zelensky government in drafting labor laws that would abolish all labor rights, allow employers to force workers to work up to 100 hours a week, and already they have already passed laws that basically cancelled subscriptions to unions and abolished all rights for women in the workplace. I think it's too easy to criticize Russian colonialism if we don't also criticize the role of Western colonialism and how Western imperialism is trying to reduce Ukraine to a pool of cheap labor and resources that they want to exploit.
1 minute, Lucia.
And that we have already seen that 7 million Ukrainians have emigrated since 1991. Many Ukrainian women are here to be exploited 24/7 in our households. Like, is this the liberation that the West is bringing to Ukraine? So I think what we need to do as communists, as internationalists, is to side with workers in Ukraine who are resisting these attacks, workers on both sides of the conflict, from workers in Italy or Greece that blocked the delivery of NATO weapons to Ukraine, but also workers from Belarus and trade unionists who also blocked the delivery of weapons to Russia and have been put in jail, and no one talks about them. And we should This is the kind of solidarity that we should support, not NATO bombs that destroyed countries from Libya to Afghanistan to Ukraine.
Well, we're going to come back now. The speakers are going to react to those contributions. They'll each have 6 minutes each. We will run over a little bit, so I apologise to those who've got to leave, who've got children in the creche. The first person to come back will be Gilbert.
Thank you. First, I want to apologize, but a big part of what has been said, I couldn't understand here because of the terrible acoustics. I don't know if on your side of the room you could hear everything, but this side of the room was very difficult to follow. I'll make 4 points. First, start by the end. Lucia has one more time repeated a canard that has been said so many times that I have refuted so many times. I never supported the no-fly zone in Libya. This is not true, period. And I defy you to find any line by me saying that. I have explained so many times this, but some people, you know, whatever you tell them, they will come back with the same. Even if you deny it, even if you prove, even if they don't have a single element to show that, to prove their accusation. So please refrain from such accusations and try to read what I said at that time. And I explained it many times. Second point, Zelensky is certainly not my hero. That's Boris Johnson's hero, maybe certainly not my hero. But is this an argument about the stand you take about a national war, a war of national defense? I mean, in the national wars against imperialism, you have had so many instances of much worse than Zelensky. When Trotsky supported the Ethiopia against Italian fascism, you think the slavist regime of Haile Selassie was more progressive than that of Zelensky? I mean, this is really an elementary argument. The tradition of the revolutionary movement has been one of support, unconditional support for just wars of national liberation, regardless of the nature of their leadership, which doesn't mean that you support uncritically that leadership. That means only that if there are communists, that's the language of the Third International, on the spot, they have to fight for to seize the leadership from the bourgeois leadership. But doesn't mean that you don't support a struggle, a national struggle, unless it is led by revolutionaries. That's a very ultra-left position that has been so many times rejected by Lenin and that tradition. The two key questions have been posed by the two first comrades who intervened. The second comrade who intervened asked, what means do you have to push Russia out of Ukraine? If you say Russia must leave Ukraine, must get out of Ukraine, this is an imperialist war and we support Ukrainian sovereignty. How can the Ukrainians fight if they don't get weapons? I mean, this is absurd. There is no answer you can give to that question that is serious, that is not laughable. Any answer other than weapons is laughable. That's one thing. Second question, Christine. Well, I see absolutely no inconsistency between, say, defending the right of the Ukrainians to get weapons from wherever they can and being against NATO, for the dissolution of NATO, and for disarmament. Actually, I mean, Alex mentioned a recent article from me in The Nation against NATO. If you see on Jacobin, you will find an article by me against the increase in military expenditure all over these countries. So am I inconsistent? No, I don't think I am at all. Because let them give weapons to the Ukrainians, but if I am for disarmament, precisely, I'm against replenishing their stocks, period. I'm against any increase in military expenditure. I am for the reduction of military expenditure, the international reduction, global disarmament. That's what we should be for, because that's what is said. And look at the contradiction that they have. They say Russia proved much weaker than was believed. When the war started, the CIA and the others were saying it will take 48 hours for Russia to invade Ukraine. And then they started saying how, oh wow, the Russians appear much weaker than we think, and they are using still Soviet-era weapons and the rest. So how do you reconcile this view that Russia is much weaker than you thought, and this view that Russia is actually being depleted from its weaponry, unfortunately using them to crush Ukraine, and at the same time explaining that you have to raise tremendously your military expenditure? It is obviously inconsistent. They are seizing the pretext, and that's why actually NATO is bringing China now in the picture, because you could say, well, Russia is weaker, but China is getting stronger. This is what we have to fight against. And there is absolutely no inconsistency, on the contrary, between this fight and the support of the just war waged by the Ukrainian people against Russian imperialism. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, let me look at my watch. Sorry to be slow. Well, Gilbert complains about slurs. I appeal to him to cease to repeat the slur of neo-Campism. We do not regard Russian imperialism as a lesser evil than Western imperialism. We look forward, you look forward. I didn't interrupt you, Gilbert. No one has interrupted you. No one has interrupted you. No, you make this, in the context of a debate here, you make an abstract, apparently abstract point about neo-Campism. You slurred Stop the War. The Campists have been completely marginalized in Stop the War. So let's avoid slurs on both sides. Secondly, you said we need to be concrete. I agree with that. But being concrete means that you can't treat all imperialist powers as the same. Of course, in other words, we have to develop a particular approach towards our imperialism. So, of course, Russian socialists, where they do, are right to call for the defeat of Russian imperialism in Ukraine. Although, I think it's interesting that Gilbert didn't answer Andy Zabrovsky's question about what the defeat of Russian imperialism means in the context of the Ukraine war, because I think it's becoming increasingly clear that Russia can't be militarily defeated, that the defeat of Russian imperialism depends crucially on the development of mass struggles, in particular working class struggles in Russia itself. But what about our imperialism? Because we're not in Russia. We're in Britain, an old imperialist country, a key prop of the US alliances like NATO. According to Gilbert, we're not a party to this war. We're simply watching it. It's just between Russia and Ukraine. But this beggars belief. And some of what Gilbert says undermines his case, because what we're seeing is a recalibration of Western imperialism that was celebrated at the NATO summit last week to confront the so-called autocracies. Most important, China. The Biden administration is very clear about that, but they're happy to start with Russia since the opportunity has been presented to them. And can I say, it's ludicrous to blame Putin for this. What we have is a bunch of predators competing with each other, maneuvering against each other. Of course they exploit what each other does, but it doesn't make him the main villain in this picture, particularly if we look at things as on a global scale. And what, sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. Of course, they're not directly engaging in combat in the war, because that would lead to World War III. Unfortunately, they're not insane. There's a degree of restraint, but they're shoveling arms on a massive scale into Ukraine, and you can't decide these historical analogies just by counting the number of aircraft or something like that. You have to look at the overall political context. Zelensky and his regime are setting themselves as the vanguard, the armed watchdog of Western imperialism in Eastern Europe. You remember when Zelensky said, "We'll be like Israel"? You know, that's a message. What is Israel in the Middle East? It's the watchdog of Western imperialism. And so when you draw comparisons with Ethiopia or whatever, it's completely ridiculous. You know, Mussolini was trying to complete the program of Italian imperialism to conquer Ethiopia, which they failed with in the late 19th century. This isn't like that now. I mean, it's true, Putin has all his Russian chauvinist fantasies. It's as if Haile Selassie had said to Britain and France, look, give me lots of weapons and I'll push the Italians back. I'll be your watchdog in this region. And then in that context, Mussolini attacked it. It wouldn't make the attack any good, but it's just not, it's a false analogy. And I don't know what Trotsky would have said in this situation. We have to decide for ourselves, not just take things by religious rote. And the situation is incredibly dangerous. They're flooding Ukraine with arms. The danger in that, particularly with all this talk of victory, that the Ukrainians must decide if there's going to be a settle. With all that talk, it's extremely dangerous, because at a certain point, the Russians could decide that they're being pushed back too far and will hit back. And then we get onto a cycle of nuclear escalation, and it's very frightening to speculate about where we would end up. What does it mean? I do think the tragedy of Gilbert's position is that it doesn't give the left anything distinctive to do. To join with the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and Boris Johnson and saying, hurrah to Ukraine, let's see Russia defeated. That's not a distinctive position. That's nothing. That's just part of the mainstream. What is our position? We want the war to end. Yes, we're in favor of disrupting the imperialist machine in its functioning. We support the Greek train workers who disrupted the supply of arms to Ukraine, because this is a conflict. Well, what we're seeing is the beginning of a struggle between the huge predators that dominate the world, and it's them that have to be stopped. And therefore, I return to what I said at the beginning. We have to get back to Luxembourg and Lenin, and they were very clear. Capitalism has produced this monster imperialism. Our task is to destroy it.
Thank you very much.